So what is the evidence for evolution? That's what we'll be talking about in this video. So what is the evidence for evolution, this change in populations over time? Well, biological evolution has left observable marks. The four sources of evidence supporting evolution include the fossil record, comparative anatomy, comparative embryology, and lastly, signs in molecular biology as well. So let's talk about each of these. The fossil record is the series of fossils that are found within different layers within the Earth's crust. Fossils are preserved remnants or impressions left by organisms that lived in the past. Now, these are most often found in sedimentary rocks, and the way that sedimentary rocks are formed are usually within some sort of water basin, whether it's a lake, pond, or even ocean. As rain happens, it will erode rocks and soil and other materials on land, carrying those materials into these basins, often filled with water, and included within that might be organisms that had lived on land or the organisms that are currently living in that water basin. Each subsequent layer of sediments ends up making a new layer of rock that can eventually solidify. And these organisms that are buried in these layers of sediments can leave impressions that also will be converted into rock. At a later time, as there is uplift and change in where water is found, we end up finding these sedimentary rocks on land, and erosion by wind and flowing water can end up revealing some of these fossils that are found. One of the keys to understand with sedimentary rocks is that the layers on the bottom were formed earlier than the layers above them. And so in this way, we can date and age fossils that are found in different layers and look at transitions over time. So the fossil record is the ordered record of fossils as they appear in rock layers. It reveals the appearance and sometimes disappearance of organisms in a historical sequence. When do we see evidence of these rock layers? And the fossil record fits with other lines of evidence supporting evolution. There's a specific field of study known as paleontology, and so paleontologists are these scientists who study fossils. They are knowledgeable of natural history and different organisms that lived in the past and their modern relatives that live in the present. These paleontologists have discovered some intermediate forms, meaning organisms that link past and present organisms. However, these intermediate forms are not as common as one would expect, and we will be talking about that in our later video. Comparative anatomy is the next line of evidence in support of evolution. Comparative anatomy, as its name suggests, is the comparison of body structures between different species, and this suggests that evolution is a remodeling process. When we look at organisms that have similar structures, we can ask ourselves, is this similarity due to common ancestry, or is it because that shape is simply most effective for that environment? Homology is the similarity in structures due to common ancestry, whereas analogy is similarity in structures because they serve a common function, but don't necessarily have common ancestry. So what are some examples of this? Well, if we look at the forelimbs of 3 different mammals, bats, whales, and humans live very different lives. We interact with our environment in very different ways. And yet when we look at the organization of the bones in our forelimbs or arms, they're remarkably similar. The flipper of a whale, the wing of a bat, and the arm of a human all have the same general organization of bones and how they relate to each other. This is an example of homology. Homologous structures are one of the best sources of information about phylogenetic relationships. Now, this term phylogenetic simply refers to the evolutionary relationship and evolutionary history of an organism. And so homologous structures are great tools to use for determining this relationship. Convergent evolution can make things a little confusing sometimes, though. Convergent evolution involves superficially similar structures in unrelated organisms, simply based on natural selection. And convergent evolution causes analogy. Analogy is similarity due to convergence. So what's an example of convergent evolution? Well, if we look at a duck-billed platypus and a duck-billed dinosaur and a duck, they all have very similar mouth shapes, but there wasn't one common ancestral duck-mouthed ancestor that gave rise to these 3 different organisms. We're dealing with a dinosaur, a duck, and a mammal. So the relationship between these isn't shared because they all have a duck bill. However, they all lived in aquatic environments. They all feed on aquatic plant material and possibly aquatic invertebrates as well. And so because of their environment and because of their diet, the mouth shape they have is simply the most effective for that environment. This is similarity due to analogy. Comparative embryology is our next line of evidence in support of evolution, this relationship between different species. Comparative embryology is the comparison of structures that appear during the development of different organisms. Closely related organisms develop in very similar ways. The relationship between organisms can be determined by comparing their development. So here in this diagram, if we didn't have the labels on the bottom, would you easily be able to tell which of these would grow up into a human and which of these would grow up into a chicken? At this stage in their life, both of them look very similar to each other and very different from their final adult form. In fact, in both of these, there are embryonic structures that are present that won't be there in the adults, such as a postanal tail or gill pouches in the neck. The last line of evidence that we'll be talking about in support of evolution is molecular biology. So this is specifically looking at the DNA and proteins and the sequences of those in organisms. Evolutionary relationships among species leave signs in the DNA and proteins. These signs can be determined by comparing genes and proteins of different organisms. Now, it turns out both the coding and the non-coding regions of DNA show similarity between closely related organisms. For example, if we're looking at a gene in the mitochondrial genome, all of these organisms on this list have mitochondria, which has their own DNA, and this cytochrome C gene is highly conserved. When we look at the cytochrome C gene's sequence, comparing humans and rhesus monkeys, there's only one difference. Comparing humans and dogs, there are 13 differences. Comparing humans and rattlesnakes, there are over 20 differences. And comparing humans all the way to moths, we have 36 differences. The farther apart two organisms are, evolutionarily speaking, the more likely some of these changes will accumulate over time. But the length of time between humans and moths having a shared common ancestor is quite significant. In our next video, we'll talk about natural selection and populations.